Well, good afternoon, everybody. What a delightful event. I'm so happy to be here and see all of you here. This is also a very important event. It is, as you know, the dissertation defense for Becca, who has been working for how many years? When did you begin writing this?
I started coursework in the fall of 2013. I started writing this in the summer of 2016.
So, depending on how you count, it's in between 2 and 5 years of sustained work. In many ways, I think you've been working all your life to prepare for writing this dissertation. It's also, as some of you might know, our very first dissertation defense in the Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion program. So it's an exciting day for lots of reasons. I think you'll be in for a real treat. Now, before we get started, and before I introduce Becca and the members of her committee, I want to say a few words about what we're actually doing here, because what we're doing is something that's been done for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it's a deeply important threshold that one has to cross, a deeply important initiation that one goes through. The first doctoral degrees were awarded a little over 800 years ago at the University of Paris in the 12th century. My own university, the University of Cambridge, began awarding them a few decades later, still about 800 years ago. And the doctoral degree was given as a terminal degree. So the point of the doctoral degree is you've progressed now as far as you can progress as a student. And after you're awarded the doctoral degree, you enter into the community of scholars and of teachers. Now, in the Middle Ages, there were two different terminal degrees. There were the master's degree, the Master of Arts, which you got if you studied in the faculties of the arts. But then there were three disciplines: divinity, law, medicine, sometimes music, that awarded the doctoral degree, a higher degree. After you'd done the Master of Arts, you could study in these other fields and receive the doctoral degree. To be a master meant that you'd mastered a body of knowledge. To be a doctor meant that you'd not only mastered it, but you'd become a teacher of it. Now, in some ways, I think that's really fitting. I don't just tell you that because I have a penchant for the Middle Ages, but I think it's really fitting because what Becca's doing and what Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion here in the Philosophy and Religion Department at CIS is doing is in continuity with what we've been doing for 800 years. And in her dissertation, if you spend the time to read it, as I've gotten the privilege of doing, you'll find that a lot of those higher arts that the Middle Ages recognized with the awarding of the doctoral degree are present in what she's thinking about. She's thinking about divinity. She's thinking about healing. She's thinking about music. So there's a tremendous amount that I think is deeply resonant with what people have been doing for centuries. And what we do, and what people have been doing for centuries, is not just awarding the degree, but also testing the candidate to see if they can pass the initiation, to see if they can undergo the initiation and pass through the threshold. Doctorates are awarded in recognition of a number of different things. One of them is the creation and interpretation of new knowledge through original research, through your own writing. Another is the acquisition and understanding of a substantial body of knowledge at the forefront of one's discipline and field. And the third is the ability to conceptualize, design, and implement a project for the generation of new knowledge. That's especially what we're here to look at today. What the dissertation is its evidence, its proof of the candidate's capacity to conceptualize, design, and implement a project to generate new knowledge that will become part of the collective inheritance of human conversation, thought, speculation, and exploration of the great mysteries of the universe. So that's what I think is happening here today. It's not just a PhD defense. It's a powerful moment in a conversation that's been going on for centuries, and that will go on for centuries after us. three of us who are involved in sitting on Becca's committee will also be involved in making judgments about what she's accomplished and what she does here today. And I want to introduce the three committee members to begin with. So first, here in the room, we have Dr. Daniel Polikoff. Daniel is an adjunct faculty member at Pacifica Graduate Institute in the Depth and Archetypal Psychology program. He's a Rilke scholar, he's a poet, he's a writer, and I'm told that he read the entirety of The Lord of the Rings with your son, is that right? When you were in Scandinavia. So, in multiple areas, he's a fitting person to be on this committee. And thank you already for what you've done so far. We also have joining us digitally, Dr. Craig Chalquist. Craig's over there on the screen. Craig's an associate provost at Pacifica Graduate Institute. He's a leading scholar of ecopsychology and ecotherapy. He used to be a core faculty member here at CIS. And Craig brings a tremendous amount of expertise in the study of Jung, in the study of psychology and ecology issues. And he's also been a wonderful contributor and supportive throughout this whole process. Finally, I'm Jacob Sherman. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the chair of the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program here at CIS, and chair also of the Philosophy and Religion department. I am not a scholar of Jung, but I've taught and read and lived with Tolkien for many years, and have thought about lots of the issues that are present in this. It's been my great honor to be chair of Becca's dissertation committee throughout this process. So finally, I want to introduce Becca Price, who has written this marvelous dissertation. I will let her tell you more about the back of Beyond. She's going to come up here and talk for 25 to 30 minutes. After that, those of us who are on the committee will ask her questions. So I know you'll want to ask her questions, and you'll get to. But first, we have to have a go. So after she talks for 30 minutes, and we do our best to ask her pointed, compelling, and maybe tricky questions, the three of us will retire somewhere else to deliberate. And at that point, all of you will have the chance to ask questions related to Becca's project, her presentation, and to her ongoing research. A little later, the three of us will return. At that point, questions will cease, and we'll make some announcements. I'll explain a little bit more about that when the time comes. So right now, would you please join me in welcoming
Carl Jung's Red Book is filled with dialogue, conversations held between Jung and his soul. In a passage near the beginning of the book, the following exchange takes place. I indignantly answered, "Do you call light what we men call the worst darkness? Do you call day night?" To this my soul spoke a word that roused my anger. My light is not of this world. I cried, "I know of no other world." The soul answered, "Should it not exist because you know nothing of it? Should this other world not exist because we know nothing of it? Or rather, should it not exist because the scientific materialist paradigm claims to know nothing of it?" Today, I wish to speak to you about this other world through the lens of a synchronicity between two red books, each crafted in the first half of the 20th century. First, let me introduce Jung's Red Book. In his late 30s, the depth psychologist Carl Jung began to have profound visionary experiences, powerful fantasies, expressions of what he called active imagination. He inscribed these visions in a large book, written in black and red letters, accompanied by rich illustrations, bound by two covers of red leather. He called the book Liber Novus, which means the new book, but it is known simply as the Red Book. And now let me introduce J.R.R. Tolkien's The Red Book of Westmarch. Tolkien set out to write a mythology, a body of legends, myths, and romantic tales that would be linked in a majestic whole. This mythology eventually took the form of The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and The Silmarillion. But within the world of the mythology itself, these tales have been written out in a book that's been passed on from generation to generation. A large book inscribed in black and red letters, accompanied by rich illustrations, bound by 2 covers of red leather. Tolkien presents himself simply as the translator of this work, and the book is known as the Red Book of Westmarch. So at first glance, the parallel names of Jung's and Tolkien's Red Books just seem to be an odd coincidence. The books actually couldn't share anything in common. On the one hand, we have Jung, one of the founders of depth psychology, an explorer of the unconscious, of archetypes, of the phenomenon of synchronicity, a Swiss man born in 1875. And then on the other hand, we have Tolkien, firmly English, a philologist and medievalist, eventually the famous author of The Lord of the Rings, one of the founders of the genre of fantasy literature, a younger man born in 1892. At first glance, there seems to be little common ground between the 2 men, other than the smoking of pipes, let alone between their work. I came to Jung's Red Book already with a strong background in Tolkien studies, having been an avid explorer of Middle-earth since age 9. When I first encountered Jung's Red Book, I felt like I was looking at a book from Tolkien's world. The style of the calligraphy, the ornamented letters, even the illustrations felt similar. A certain resonance seemed to exist between the 2 bodies of work, a convergence of images, a synchronicity, to use Jung's terminology, a synchronicity of imagination. My dissertation is an exploration of this synchronicity. In it, I demonstrate the numerous parallels between the 2 Red Books, parallels in timing, in imagery, and narrative. These are present despite the 2 men having no direct contact with each other. These correlations could be dismissed as mere coincidence. But what if they're not? What then might they imply about their source, which seems to be accessible through the imagination? In my dissertation, I'm presenting the idea that the synchronicity of the 2 Red Books ontologically demonstrates the reality of the imagination as a collective source of participatory knowledge. I'm also presenting the resonances and some discordancies between Jung's theory of the collective unconscious and Tolkien's notion of fairy, or what Henri Corbin called the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal realm. We access this co-creative source through the imagination. The imaginal realm is both objectively real and also participatively enacted. I've structured my dissertation in the form of a journey in 7 stages. It begins in the external world of consensus reality, and it moves inward to another realm. When the threshold is crossed, the world on the inside opens out into a vast landscape that is as infinite as the outer. The first 2 chapters engage with the circumstances of Tolkien's and Jung's lives, exploring the conditions, talents, interests, and proclivities of both men to better understand what went into the creation of the 2 Red Books. The first parallel that stood out is one of timing. Carl Jung began his Red Book period, so the time of his psychological descent when the fantasy images began coming to him in waking life, in 1913. At the same time, J.R.R. Tolkien began making an unusual series of illustrations in a sketchbook that he called the Book of Ishness. Virtually simultaneously, both men took an unusual turn in their lives. They turned away from the outer images, from the world of common day, and focused instead upon the inner images of imagination. Jung's Red Book period is considered to have spanned the years 1913 to 1930, but the primary content of the visions came to him from late 1913 through about 1917. Most of the sketches in Tolkien's Book of Ishnis were done over a shorter period of time, from December of 1911 through the summer of 1913. He made his earliest Ishnises, these first imaginal drawings. But Tolkien actually continued to add illustrations to the Book of Ishnis up until 1928, so almost the exact same years as Jung's Red Book period. Many of these images depict an entrance, a crossing of a threshold, or some fantastical landscape. Perhaps one of the most striking images in the Book of Ishnis is this one, titled End of the World. You can see here a small figure stepping off a cliff by the sea. Yes, the image of a man stepping off a cliff and the title End of the World seem somber, even depressing. But perhaps they convey a dual meaning. This isn't only the end of the world, referring to its demise, or the death of this particular man, but it's the end of the world, as in it's the end of the known world. He's reached the edge, and he wants to continue his journey. One can see the end of the world as a symbol of the threshold that Tolkien crossed at this time, the doorway to the imaginal, into what he called the realm of fairy. Here are a few more images from Tolkien's Book of Ishnis to give you a fuller sense of his visions. This is eeriness, wickedness, under 10-ishness. This one's paired with one called grown-up-ishness. Beyond. My title, The Back of Beyond, is also drawn from one of Tolkien's Ishnises. Alongside these visionary drawings, another form of creativity was emerging through Tolkien as well, the arts of language. Tolkien was trying his hand at writing poetry and prose not only in English, but in languages of his own invention, Elvish languages. Mai govannen, Melanin, Ellen sila lumen omenti elvo. Tolkien wrote the first story of Middle-earth in September 1914. Although the primary creative periods for both Jung and Tolkien were during these potent years of the 1910s, they each spent the rest of their lives developing the material they encountered during this time. One of the earliest visions that came to both Jung and to Tolkien was of major significance to both of them, an overpowering flood. Tolkien sometimes called it the Great Wave. The first of Jung's flood visions came to him while on a train journey in October 1913. To quote Jung's words, "I was suddenly overcome in broad daylight by a vision. I saw a terrible flood that covered all the northern and low-lying lands between the North Sea and the Alps. It reached from England up to Russia, and from the coast of the North Sea right up to the Alps. I saw yellow waves, swimming rubble, and the death of countless thousands." 2 weeks later, Jung was subjected to the vision again. This time it was accompanied by a voice that was saying, "Look at it, it is completely real, and it will come to pass. You cannot doubt this." An uncannily similar vision came repeatedly to J.R.R. Tolkien, in dreams and also while awake. He called it his Atlantis haunting. In Tolkien's words, this legend or myth or dim memory of some ancient history has always troubled me. In sleep, I had the dreadful dream of the ineluctable wave, either coming out of the quiet sea or coming and towering over the green inlands. It still occurs occasionally, though now exorcised by writing about it. It always ends by surrender, and I wake gasping out of deep water. Tolkien wrote of the great wave again and again throughout his life. In each telling, the wave destroys a great civilization. A vast abyss opens in the sea, and it swallows an inhabited island in all its glory. When World War I broke out in August 1914, Carl Jung recognized that his vision of the destructive flood was prophetic of the war. His interior images were reflecting the external political and cultural situation in Europe. So when the war broke out, Jung realized he wasn't going mad, as he'd been afraid that he was doing. Rather, his internal experience was mirroring the madness unfolding in the external world. Now, Tolkien fought in that same war. Needless to say, the war had a tremendous effect upon Tolkien, particularly the Battle of the Somme, in which 2 of his closest friends were killed. Everything he wrote afterwards bears the trauma of the Great War. My third chapter in the dissertation explores the liminal space between worlds. I look at Jung's practice of active imagination, in which you hold in your awareness an image from a dream or a vision until you come into active relationship to it. You can then dialogue with the figures that emerge. You can enter into the drama itself. I'm suggesting that active imagination can be understood not simply as a means of accessing the unconscious in an objective sense, but rather as a form of participation in the collective unconscious. I would posit, drawing in part on Jorge Ferrer's work in transpersonal theory, that active imagination can be understood as a form of participatory knowing. The fantasies that Jung encountered through active imagination can be seen as transpersonal participatory events, a co-creative enaction between the human organ of the imagination and the non-determined archetypal power of the collective unconscious. Now, based on evidence in his writings, it seems Tolkien was also engaging in a similar method to Jung's practice of active imagination, and perhaps also was having visionary experiences that he called Fairy dramas. Tolkien spoke of how his stories arose in his mind as given. He would say, "I always had the sense of recording what was already there somewhere, not of inventing." The there somewhere to which he is referring is fairy, the imaginal realm. Tolkien described this realm as follows. "The land of fairy story is wide and deep and high. In that land, a man may, perhaps, count himself fortunate to have wandered, but its very mystery and wealth make dumb the traveler who would report. The fairy gold too often turns to withered leaves when it is brought away. All that I can ask is that you, knowing all these things, will receive my withered leaves, as a token at least that my hand once held a little of the gold." My hand once held a little of the gold. Jung made a similar statement, a statement that mirrors symbolically what Tolkien said. This is Jung. "I felt that at some time or other I had passed through the Valley of Diamonds, but I could convince no one, not even myself when I looked at them more closely, that the specimens I had brought back were not mere pieces of gravel." The Valley of Diamonds, the gold of fairy. Both men were describing a place they had seen, a place that couldn't be fully captured in language. To construct a theoretical framework for interpreting the synchronicity of the 2 red books, I drew on a number of diverse streams of thought. On the one hand, Jung's practice of active imagination and the theory of the collective unconscious. I drew on Tolkien's theory of imagination, which he called subcreation. Subcreation is essentially a process in 2 primary stages: the experience of images arising through the imagination, and then the art of shaping those images into the final result, which Tolkien called a subcreation. Subcreation in part stems from Coleridge and the English Romantic tradition. But I've also drawn together Henri Corbin's Sufi mysticism, James Hillman's archetypal psychology, a hint of Platonic philosophy, and contemporary transpersonal theory as well. There are, of course, critical differences between each of these perspectives, yet together they provide an illuminating parallax view on the creative imagination and on the imaginal realm. The remaining 4 chapters of my dissertation take place, you could say, within the imaginal realm itself. To be clear, these are not the same books. We can learn as much from their differences as from their similarities, but I'm presenting more of the similarities here today. Jung's first fully immersive vision begins at the entrance to a dark cave, which is guarded by a dwarf. Inside the cave, there's icy water and an island rock at the middle. A glowing red crystal is on this rock. A massive black scarab moves through the scene. In this chapter, I explore the numerous parallels between this first fantasy of Jung's and scenes in Tolkien's works of the many underworld, underground journeys that take place in Middle-earth. The dark journey through the lost dwarf realm, Moria. Frodo and Sam's fearful passage through the midnight tunnel of the monstrous spider Shelob, who resembles the giant scarab that Jung encountered. Aragorn and the Grey Company's journey through the paths of the dead, where they encounter a host of the dead, a parallel to Jung's engagement with the host of the dead deeper in the Red Book. Bilbo's encounter with the dragon Smaug in the halls of Erebor, the Lonely Mountain. And Bilbo's fateful encounter with the twisted creature Gollum, whose lair is deep within a mountain cavern, upon a little island rock set within the icy waters of a subterranean lake. Upon that rock, like the red crystal in Jung's vision, lay long hid the One Ring, the ring of power made by the Dark Lord Sauron. In both Red Books, the heart of the narrative begins here, upon this island rock, where a lost treasure of unknown power is hid, waiting for a new hand to grasp it. This first vision of Jung's also bears some resemblance to this ishness of Tolkien's, which I'm returning to, titled Before, drawn just 1 year earlier. You can see the dark, oppressive entryway that pulls your gaze toward the mysterious red glow at the end of the passage. The particular shape of this imposing doorway appears again and again in Tolkien's later writings and artwork, usually accompanied by descriptions of foreboding, fear, and the unknown. It's a doorway underground, a doorway to the underworld. The encounter with the dragon is repeated throughout both Red Books as well, both in the narrative and in quite a few illustrations. These denizens of the deep are ambiguous creatures, symbols of good and evil, of power and wisdom. My 5th chapter leads one on a journey through the landscapes of Faerie, through enchanted forests where we meet tree beings in one book or Ents in the other, and depictions of the world tree. Or, in Tolkien's case, 2 world trees. The 2 trees of Valinor. This was also in the Book of Ishnas. In both Red Books, many of these trees emanate their own light. They bear celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, stars, in their branches. Sometimes the text in one Red Book will describe the content in a drawing from the other. So for example, Jung writes, "I look. To the right it is dark night. To the left it is bright day. The rock separates day and night." Tolkien painted this image to accompany his Silmarillion cycles, and it's one of the last images in the Book of Ishnas. Here we have 2 images designed with remarkably similar composition. On the left is the first illuminated letter in Jung's Red Book. On the right is the last drawing Tolkien ever made to illustrate his own Red Book. Both show a striated landscape, the lower third underwater, hills rising into the background, the sun's rays extending dramatically. In Jung's, there is a triple conjunction of the moon, Jupiter, and Saturn in the left corner. In Tolkien's, the star Erendil, which represents Venus, glimmers faintly in the morning sky in the same position. And both symbolize each man's cosmology, although in different ways. My sixth chapter engages with the cosmogonic myths both Jung and Tolkien wrote. Creation stories they composed just 3 years apart, in 1916 and 1919, respectively. In this chapter, I also explore the role of Christ in each work, particularly the absence or the veiled presence of this figure. And finally, I engage with the nature of evil. A pair of images I find particularly striking are these. On the left is one of Tolkien's many illustrations of the Eye of Sauron. On the right is an illuminated letter from one of the pages of Jung's Red Book. One of the most profound areas in which Jung's and Tolkien's visions and respective worldviews overlap is around the nature of evil. They both had a deep understanding of the nature of evil. They could address its presence in the world, show the importance of confronting it on behalf of personal and collective transformation. Within The Lord of the Rings, the clearest view we are given of the Dark Lord is his great eye, an image of malice and hatred made visible. Amazingly, Jung also had a description in his Red Book correlating to Tolkien's Eye of Sauron. Jung writes, "Nothing is more valuable to the evil one than his eye, since only through his eye can emptiness seize gleaming fullness. And it drinks it in by means of its eye, which is able to grasp the beauty and unsullied radiance of fullness. It sees the most beautiful and wants to devour it in order to spoil it." The single eye that symbolizes evil is an eye that looks only outward. It doesn't look inward. It doesn't self-reflect. This eye cautions against the refusal to look deep into one's innermost self, to face the shadow within. Looking only outward, one becomes subsumed by that shadow, blind to it from within. Indeed, both Jung and Tolkien even use the same term shadow to refer to this darkness that must be confronted. My final chapter looks at two primary figures in both Red Books, the Wisdom Keepers. The first of these is Philemon in Jung's Red Book, and in Tolkien's, it is Gandalf. And I conclude this chapter in homage to the other Wisdom Keeper. She came to Jung as his soul. He thought she was his soul, and he would later come to call her the Anima. But I believe she is even more than this. Looking to Tolkien's Red Book, we see this figure in other forms: Galadriel, Elbereth Gilthoniel, and most importantly, the Queen of Faerie. She is the Anima Mundi. J.R.R. Tolkien and C.G. Jung were offered a gift, an invitation that allowed each of them to cross the threshold into the world of the imagination. There is a reason it's called the perilous realm. It's dangerous to enter this domain and folly to wander its paths without a guide. If one isn't careful, madness can ensue. This is what Tolkien means when he says, "Lest the gates be shut and the keys be lost." The doorway can shut, and one can find oneself locked eternally in a world of symbols without the ability to return to the external world or to connect again with others in the realm of consensus reality. Or one can be shut out forever, living in a world devoid of enchantment, believing life to be little more than the struggle for survival, making up meaning as a way to get through one's daily toil. Jung and Tolkien entered the Mundus Imaginalis during a time in history and as part of a modern culture that didn't see the spiritual, the numinous, or the imaginal as part of the natural world. They each came of age in an era of disenchantment. The world had been scoured of its angels and demons, its elves, dwarves, and dragons. The starry sky was merely a void, the moon and sun only atoms and energy. Trees were only a source of wood, and high mountains only a repository of coal and minerals. Where did they go, the lost beings who were no longer believable, no longer real? They retreated into the imaginal world to await a time when they might be rediscovered there, seen by those who had eyes to see. The Queen of Faerie, the Anima Mundi, extends an invitation to those who are willing to cross her threshold, to return to that realm and behold its wonders and its terrors. She asks those who tread the pathways of her realm to give her a gift in return, the gift of remembrance. Please record your experience, whether it's in song or tale, in painting or poetry, or in the quiet memories shared with a loved one. Believe that these experiences are real. There's a bridge between here and there, and if you've had the privilege to cross it, leave a trace so that others too may find their way. And someday, when enough people return with eyes and hearts and minds open to the Mundus Imaginalis, they will remember that this is our world. The two realms have only been falsely separated. The bridge walked between realms doesn't go only in one direction. And perhaps the denizens of Faerie can one day return to the natural world. Perhaps we are facilitating the return of the Queen to her full domain. Thank you.
So now's the time when we get a chance to ask some questions.
All right.
Which I will take the privilege of being your committee chair and start. Thank you for that. Thank you for that presentation and for this work. This has been a delight to work on with you.
Thank you.
So I'm trying to think of which question I want to start with. In your discussion of Tolkien and Jung's parallax visions, right? I love the image you presented. Both of them sort of having a different vantage point on something similar. You do a great job of showing us these images and presenting these parallels, and I think you make a compelling case that what they're exploring is not merely fantasy in the way that language is regularly used, right? So not what Tolkien meant by fantasy, but the dismissive way people talk about fantasy. But I'm wondering, I'm really compelled by a lot of that, but I'm wondering what governs, or what are the rules that govern whether or not something is actually a vision of something real, or if it's an illusion. I'm thinking of this. So I was reading Iamblichus, the Neoplatonic theurgical philosopher from antiquity, the other day, and Iamblichus has this point where he's talking about meeting with the gods, the daimones, the heroes, and things of that sort. And in chapter 6, and it's very similar to the kind of ascents that Tolkien and Jung both go on, and some of the parallels that you draw between their cosmogonies and the Gnostics and stuff. And in chapter 6, Iamblichus says, but some of them tell the truth, and some of them are boastful and arrogant and false. And so he gives a whole set of ways to try to determine whether or not the visionary encounter is veridical or if it's just an illusion. He doesn't go the route we would, which is it just projection or whatever, but that's also in the mix. So I'm wondering, what are the criteria that you use to determine that? And then maybe what are the criteria, related question, what are the criteria that Jung and Tolkien use to know whether something has the ring of truth, whether they're exploring a similar geography rather than a similar fantasy in the denuded sense?
That's a good question. I think I want to start by looking at how Jung and Tolkien approach that question. And as part of my own answer to it, that ambiguity is, I believe, inherently part of these visionary experiences. The fact that the question is even there is part of the inherent nature of these experiences, and the doubt that they bring up, and then therefore the belief and the faith that has to accompany them in order to, in some sense, verify that they are real. I know that for Tolkien, there was so much ambiguity and doubt around this, and you really have to kind of glean his letters and even what he put within his stories to get a sense of how he's trying to make sense of this. But repeatedly he's talking about reporting something that happened to him, and this feeling that comes up that he wasn't inventing, he wasn't making it up. And Jung very much is using similar language, this conviction that this is a real experience and it's not fleeting. I think that in part, I know that Jung was searching for parallels to his own experience. He was looking back through history, and he found a number of different individuals, and he was particularly struck by the Gnostics with their experiences that paralleled his. And then when he found alchemy, he actually just set aside the Red Book and stopped working on it, because he's like, oh, this is it. This is what I went through, what these alchemists are writing about. I think he would have been fascinated to know that what Tolkien was going through and creating, and that he also had a Red Book, because Tolkien provides a modern parallel in the same time period. And so in some sense, it comes back to that parallax view, that it's about finding a consensus reality, not in this external world, but actually starting to develop a consensus reality in that imaginal world, and being able to share what the different visions are. And I find that, for me, one of the keys to following that is synchronicity. And so I'll find that when I share a synchronicity with another person or with multiple people, then we can all have that experience of, wow, is that real? Is that a part of our world? And it's that shared experience in some sense. And so I guess part of that, part of my answer then would be is that it's a community activity, that it can't be done alone. And of course, these are themes that I explore within the narratives of both Red Books, but particularly Tolkien's, that it is about a fellowship, that nothing can be accomplished by oneself. There's no single hero accomplishing the tasks. It's always done in community and in relationship. And so I feel like that is part of how to establish some sense of these visions are real, is when they are shared. And that's why I concluded with the importance of recording your experience and remembering it, and in some sense having the bravery to share that has happened. Sonu Shamdasani, who is the editor of Jung's Red Book, after the Red Book was published, he got countless letters from people saying, I thought I was the only person who had experiences like this, that had visions like this, and this is affirming that I'm not the only one, or that they're not pathological. So, yeah, I think that finding community consensus is part of establishing whether these visions are real, and being able to bridge between the two domains. Otherwise, it becomes a situation where one is purely locked in that realm of symbols and no one can verify with you that what you're seeing is what anyone else might be seeing.
When you were talking, it kept reminding me of, you know this way better than I do, of in the Ainu Lindale, when the first of the Ainu are created, they begin singing alone, right? And each of them has, in singing alone, each of them has a kind of vision of the divine. That's their own song. And they only begin to learn the rest of it by hearing one another sing and joining together, which struck me as a kind of parallel to what you're describing.
Yeah, I feel like Tolkien embedded in so much of what he wrote the meaning of what he was going through at the same time. And so his stories actually act as an interpretive lens in many ways. And yeah, so the Ainur all come together and they sing, and it's when they come together as a group to sing, that's when the world can come into being, as opposed to being these separate visions.
I could come back to, there's more to talk about there, but I will pass it on to some of my colleagues.
Yeah.
Daniel.
Well, I'd like to pick up with a question that, in a way, is connected to Jake's question. And as he intimated, there's so many paths to follow with this material. It's so tremendously rich, and you've done such a wonderful job of evoking especially the parallels between Jung and Tolkien. I would like to try and put a little bit of pressure to start pulling apart some of the differences, which you said you paid less attention to, at least in this little presentation. You mentioned that Corbin's idea of the imaginal world is a kind of a metaphysical ground for the parallel you draw between Tolkien's realm of fairy on the one hand and the domain of what Jung calls the collective unconscious. I just want to ask if you see any critical differences between especially fairy on the one hand and the collective unconscious on the other. I'm thinking particularly of the fact that Jung would have no trouble at all seeing Nazism or fascism as a kind of welling up of aspects of the collective unconscious. Whereas to ascribe that same kind of image to fairy would not be so natural. I don't think Tolkien would make that kind of translation. Or maybe he would. So I just wanted you to elaborate a little bit about you know, the differences between fairy and the collective unconscious, as well as the parallax.
Yeah, I brought all of these terms together, and in doing that, and also in working with my committee, was able to start to see more of the differences, or what I had assumed to be greater similarities. I feel like there's more of an equivalence between the mundus imaginalis and fairy, as Tolkien describes it and as Corbin describes it. And the more I focused on that, the more Jung's collective unconscious started to seem like something quite different. And it was actually by bringing a participatory perspective into dialogue with all that, I started to be able to hold together these inherent differences and yet recognize that there's an overlap here. For Corbin, the mundus imaginalis is a sacred domain, and so as you're saying, something like Nazism isn't going to arise as kind of an archetypal expression out of that domain. whereas that is very fitting of how Jung is describing the collective unconscious. Jung is in many ways limiting himself by his commitment to a Kantian perspective, and so he's holding all of his observations of these experiences and of this realm within a framework of this is part of the human psyche and the experience of the human psyche, and therefore the collective unconscious is made up of all past human experiences. Hillman calls it, he prefers to just call it the weight of human history. And I don't feel that it's just the weight of human history that is what is present in the imaginal realm or in fairy. I would hold, though, that Tolkien probably could see some of those much darker elements in fairy. And that's why Mordor is in fairy, dragons are in fairy. It's a pretty heavy place in some regions. And so in some sense, you could almost see fairy as bridging Corbin's idea of the mundus imaginalis and Jung's idea of the collective unconscious. But I feel like in some sense, Jung's concepts don't provide a full framework to interpret what he went through. And that's why it felt important to turn to Corbin and to turn to Hillman and also to turn to Tolkien to kind of break it out of those boundaries of keeping that simply within the experiential realm of the human psyche, and rather, is this something that is about more than that, about the cosmos, about the divine? And that's more what you find in the mundus imaginalis and in fairy, and the understanding of it as a co-creative enaction between the individual human imagination and a non-determinate divinity, could say, or a non-determinate archetypally patterned divinity, is how I started talking about it. But these, I think I'm going to be contemplating this part of what I've been trying to articulate for the rest of my life. I hope I will be. These are the deep mysteries. But yeah, I wouldn't equate them.
Right. If I could just extend Jake's question and connect it with mine, it's also true, it seems that while Jung's idea of the collective unconscious doesn't have the same sacred quality, it does give a purchase on human history and human evil. So you could look at Nazism or many other phenomenon that will remain unnamed at present as this, what you were speaking about is imaginary visions that are shared but are somehow distorted, distortions of archetypes. And so that might be an interesting idea to think about too, in relation as well to Melkor, you know, who this notion of a distortion or a shadow of a, and Jung's, idea of the collective conscious might help thinking about, not excluding the way these archetypes get distorted.
And that's also where I feel like the participatory perspective helps, because in reading these two Red books, there often, for me, come up questions around individual biases on the part of Tolkien and Jung. There's certainly elements of misogyny in both, and racism, and is that really also echoing to the truth that they were maybe accessing, or is that part of the co-creative enaction and it's being shaped and in some sense distorted by their own life experiences, by the cultures in which they're raised, by the assumptions and so forth. So that helps kind of account for that and let you see through it as well.
Craig, do you want to ask a question of Becca?
I do. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you very well, and I can repeat if others can't, or Jake can.
Why don't you
Hi,
repeat?
Becca. Before before I ask my question, I want to express my appreciation and admiration for how you have courageously followed your fascination into this deep scholarship, and even beyond the content of what you've given us, which is brilliant. I look at your work as reinvesting scholarship with imagination, psyche, and soul, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
Made it such a pleasure to work with you. And I should mention too that although I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, I decided for your special day to tie two of my neckties together. So I don't know if you can see this, but one necktie is the Red Book of Young.
Oh my gosh.
And the other necktie is the Norse Eddas for Tolkien. So double blessings for your special day today.
Thank you so much. They would both be so proud, too. Oh, I knew that was going to happen. Oh my gosh, don't try reading this.
Welcome soul in many different senses into your work. And so now to get to my question, I'm thinking about the nature of the program that you're graduating from, and I was wondering if you could say a few words about the ecological implications or lessons in this convergence of the two Red Books for our time.
Definitely. It's interesting because that's actually what, when I originally came to this program, I wanted to write about Tolkien, ecology, and imagination, and then I stumbled across the two Red Books, and that became, that's everything. That became my focus, but that's always been kind of underlying. What are the ecological implications of having a re-enchanted, imaginal perspective on the world? And part of what I found in both Red Books is how vibrant and alive and sentient the landscapes are. And so I have a whole chapter called The Landscapes of Faerie, because we encounter these forests that are covering the threshold between realms. There are trees that are these sacred trees that have celestial bodies in their branches. And then, of course, there are all of the parts of our world that show up in the Red Books, like the sun and the moon and the stars and the sea, and all of these qualities of our landscape that in so many ways we're actually isolated from in cities and civilization. And I actually find that, and I've felt this from a very young age, that when I felt most like I was walking through Middle Earth was when I was just out in the natural world and would see, you know, the spires of mist rising through the redwoods, and that felt like enchantment more than any kind of expression of seeking something that we might call magic or something that is fantastical. I feel like I can't use words anymore, so like fantasy and imagination, because I've kind of redefined all of them as something that's real, and that they derive their sense of unreality, imagination, fantasy, when we say, oh, that's just imaginary, or oh, that's just a fantasy, not from the word fantasy or imagination, but from those degrading words, just or only. And in many ways, I think that's what we've done to the natural landscape too, is, oh, that's just a tree, or that's just a rock. And being able to, in some sense, rediscover the elements of our world through Faerie, through the imagination, we can actually recognize that all of that is here. All of that is part of our world. And I don't have any kind of, I don't know, overly rosy visions that will just kind of change the trajectory of where we're going. But for individuals it can, and for individuals it can start to shift that relationship to to the landscapes that we call home and that we're utterly dependent on, and recognize that those are the places where these beings of fairy, these denizens of fairy that both Jung and Tolkien encountered in their different red books, where we can find them again in a certain sense. So there's this image from Corbin of when you go to the Mundus Imaginalis, you go inward up until the point where everything turns outward again. You find yourself on the outside of the convex sphere. And so you go in and the world then opens out into a natural landscape again. And it's these very elements that I think are calling us back into that realm. Does that help answer the question? Yeah.
I'll go again.
You look really excited about that.
It's a wonderful chance to get to talk to you about these. I so resonate with what Craig said about your work returning soul to scholarship, and there is something really wonderful about the way you include. I think also the way you include your experience and your first-person voice throughout your dissertation as a model for that. It's really, it is really a delight to read and to have worked with. I want to push you to also think about what Hillman would call the sort of spirit side. And I think the way to do it is, like you, I love the image of the metaxy, right? The in-between that you invoke a few times in your dissertation, that the imaginal is sort of this in-between realm. But I want to ask you to what extent we can also think, as it were, about the influences from below and from above. And what I mean by that is, if we're thinking about Jung and Tolkien from below, to what extent are there shared imaginal experiences, and are there the similarities between the Red Book, or the fact that they're both white guys smoking a pipe? To what extent is that can that be illumined just by sort of like the ordinary tools of scholarship, paying attention to textual reception, cultural history, sociological conditioning? You know, they're both Europeans who grew up in an area where dragon tales are present and so forth. So that's the sort of from below side. And that's maybe a not as interesting a question for lots of us, but it's still important. And then the from above side is, to what extent do you think, and here I'm asking you to speculate, maybe you could pull on what Tolkien and Jung think. Jung's pretty cagey about it. Tolkien maybe has a little more to say. But to what extent, if there is a shared realm that they're exploring, if there's a geography of fairy, not just a geography, but a dramatic structure of fairy that repeats in not just the monomyth, but the undoing of the hero's journey and all this stuff, to what extent is that grounded in metaphysical or theological a metaphysical or a theological source that provides some, right? How does fairy live? What are the conditions of possibility for a world that we can participatively engage in? So that's my from above and my from below.
Well, I'll start with from below.
Okay.
And I feel like that has been an important element for interpreting the parallels between the two Red Books, because there is a shared cultural history between them. And so we can look and identify Norse mythology influencing what both of them were writing, and certainly the Judeo-Christian tradition, and the folk tales and legends of Europe. They were both very much inspired by the Germanic legends and so on. And so I think that's a really important layer, in some sense, to identify all of that and then say, okay, why are they still similar? Why are there such particular correspondences in so many cases that can't simply be reduced to like a fairy tale motif or a Jungian archetype? And in my introduction, actually, I talk about how I'm not doing a Jungian reading of Tolkien or a Jungian reading of both Red books, because, first of all, that's been done on Tolkien, and so I didn't feel that I should do it again. But also, there can be a reduction that happens, a equating of, well, this means this and this means that, and the stories get kind of twisted and conformed into a pattern that doesn't actually reflect the particularities of what they are. And suddenly you lose the mystery and the feeling and what drew you to both Red books in the first place. But I think that's an important layer to identify all of those and see, yes, we can recognize in Philemon and Gandalf the archetype of the wise old man. And they're even more similar than the archetype of the wise old man, and forming both of them is going to account for. As for From Above, I definitely think Tolkien would be much more comfortable answering this than Jung, because this actually comes back to Tolkien's idea of subcreation. And the reason he calls it subcreation is it's creation under God. And so the gift of the images arising through imagination is a gift given by God. And in some sense, he felt that by subcreating fantasy, by creating a secondary world that the mind can enter, and when you enter into that world, what is related is true in that world. Tolkien felt that doing so was actually in some sense, furthering the efflorescence of creation, that creative gift, the creative imagination that's given to human beings was given by God. And so he says fantasy is and remains a human right. We make in our measure and our derivative mode because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker. And so I think for Tolkien that answer is very, very clear, that it's God that's standing behind it. And he has this great phrase, he's like, God is the Lord of elves and of men. And that was very much part of his worldview. Jung would be more hesitant with that. And so I almost want to look within the Red Book itself for that answer, because a major part of the narrative of Jung's Red Book is the rebirth of God in this realm. And he goes through this experience of encountering a God of the old world who is wounded by his scientific materialism. And this God is dying. And he suddenly has this idea, he's like, if I can convince him that he's a fantasy, then I can get him off this mountain. And it takes a while, but he eventually convinces the God that he's a fantasy, and he's able to carry him down the mountain, which parallels this really beautiful scene in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings when Sam carries Frodo up Mount Doom, and they both mirror the story of St. Christopher carrying Christ. There's more there, but I won't get sidetracked. But what Jung is doing is he's recognizing that fantasy actually has the power to save the life of God. So Nietzsche has declared God to be dead, and Jung encounters in the imaginal world God, and through this process facilitates the rebirth of God, and God is so much bigger than when he first encountered him and ascends. So in some sense, for Jung, I think that from above gets actually pulled back in and down and through into that middle realm. And I kind of see it as a process, and this was some of the material in relation to the Anima Mundi, that we're in a process of, if fantasy can save the life of a God, and then we recognize that fantasy in itself is real, but a different order of reality, then the gods can be reborn in a time where they really need to be reborn. So.
That's awesome. Yeah. So it reminds me of Barfield's statement that I love so much, where Barfield says, you know, Pan isn't dead. Pan has closed up shop, but he hasn't died. He's just gone indoors.
Yeah, and maybe we're in the process of opening the
shutters.
door again. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to give you a chance to speak, again, picking up on this interesting discussion, to what you feel are the most salient values represented by Tolkien on the one hand and Jung on the other, whether, and potentially some differences between those, acknowledging that they're both working with the imaginal. But there are, you know, some quite weighty differences between two men. And as a cue, perhaps, I want to pick up on one of the very interesting observations you made in the thesis. You can run with this cue or not. An observation that Tolkien seems often more invested in seeing good and evil as clear opposites. That's borne out very palpably in the, at some level in The Lord of the Rings, which is a struggle between good and evil. You know, whereas Jung seems at times invested in seeing in the ambiguity, and that you know, the serpent or dragon is not just evil, but is maybe very, very positive in a certain respect. So how, and this is, you know, part of his answer to Job too. You know, the intertwining of good and evil. So just kind of throw the floor open for you to see what each of these wonderful authors is kind of is a kind of central core value with respect to issues of good and evil.
I feel too that I just want to kind of set parameters around what I can answer in relation to Jung, because I've, in the scope of the dissertation, focused most on Jung as he was in the Red Book, period.
Which is very important.
Yeah, and so Jung changed a lot, and so I'm mostly going to be speaking to the Red Book Jung. Tolkien I can kind of give a broader sense, because in part just because I've studied his whole life in greater depth, but also because his Red Book period extended over a longer period of time. I think that's right, that when you approach both Red Books, it appears that in Tolkien's you see this very clear polarity between good and evil, and that seems quite stark. You have the Dark Lord Sauron, you have the free peoples of Middle-earth fighting for their lives and their freedom, their independence. And with Jung, it is much more ambiguous, and the serpent that slithers all the way through the pages of Liber Novus carries those qualities so much that she is antagonistic, and yet she's wise, and she's a guide, and yet she kind of pushes in relation to Jung. But I feel like below that, it starts to get a little mixed up, because a lot of that ambiguity is coming from the figure of Jung, and I'm saying the figure of Jung because Jung includes himself in the Red Book, but he is in a sense also an imaginal figure in that realm. He is extremely antagonistic with these figures as they emerge, and so when he sees evil in the other, is he really seeing evil, or is he just really uncomfortable in the fact that he is in these fantasies right now? And does he really want to be taking in what they're saying? And so some of that starts to kind of break down. And when Philemon is being accused of all of, being a betrayer and all these horrible things, is he really that? Or is Jung learning a painful lesson? And then in Tolkien too, they seem to be, good and evil seem to be quite split. And yet, there too, you can see how they blend. And I think one of the kind of places that holds them together is around the idea of power. So all of the most powerful figures in Middle-earth, Gandalf, Elrond, Galadriel, they all reject the ring because they absolutely know that because of their power, they will become instruments of evil. And you see that with the climax of the story too, that it's only possible for the ring to be destroyed because Frodo has to become evil. In some way, there is no other choice. And so again, in these figures, the most angelic figure of Frodo, the most Christ-like, he has to fall in order for the ring to be destroyed. And you can see that echoing all the way back up through the through Tolkien's cosmogony, where that ambiguity is right there at the beginning in the creation of the world. Are you seeing evil introduced by one figure, this kind of Lucifer-like figure, or is he an expression of God's shadow? So reading the two of them together starts to blur the lines in both directions, I found. And as for the most salient values, there's this wonderful story about Tolkien. Late in his life, he received a letter from a man who considered himself to be an atheist, but he was just kind of having dawning religious feeling. And he said to Tolkien that his book has a sanctity to it that is like light from an invisible lamp. It's everywhere, but you can't locate the source. And the way that that light is present in Tolkien's stories, what we identify as the light, I think, are his most salient values, the kind of the moral guidelines that he's kind of embedded within the worldview. And on the one hand, it's a Christian worldview, and on the other hand, that's all been soaked into the symbolism of the story.
Craig, do you have another question you'd like to ask Becca?
I do. I have one more question. So Becca, here's these two men who both, if you were to ask either one, are you a Gnostic, would probably deny it. Tolkien, on the one hand, is a fairly traditional Catholic believer, and flat out denied that he was a Gnostic. And yet, as you and Lance Owens and other people have noticed, there was this huge upwelling of Gnostic imagery, both in Tolkien's work and also in Jung's Red Book. And so I want you to speculate a little bit as to why that is. And I don't mean the why so much in terms of their personal psychologies, but maybe the bigger why, the historical why, or what were the gods up to with this huge influx of Gnostic imagery? Why? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Well, I know if I were to ask them both directly, they would say no, absolutely not. Looking at Jung, we have more, which you've of course written about, more evidence of what Jung's exposure to Gnosticism was, even at the time that he was working on the Red Book. He definitely was reading the available Gnostic texts in 1915, and he may even have encountered them earlier when he was working on Transformations and Symbols of the Libido, which was published in 1911 and 1912. Not all the Gnostic texts that are available to us now were available to him then. And as far as I've been able to uncover, I don't know if Tolkien would have actually directly read any Gnostic material. He was quite young when he wrote the first version of his cosmogony, the Ainu Lindale, and I feel a certain amount of doubt that he actually would have had direct exposure to Gnostic material, considering his upbringing and what he would have had access to and what he wouldn't have. And I think he would have, just as because he was a devout Catholic, he would inherently have said, no, I'm not a Gnostic. But it is very interesting that these two cosmogonic myths that the two men wrote, just 3 years apart, have all of these Gnostic elements, very explicitly so in Jung's, where it's the 7 sermons to the dead, and it begins with the pleroma and then moves through to the emergence out of the pleroma of God and the devil, and kind of all of these different structures of the Gnostic creation myth. Tolkien's creation myth carries these elements, but they're hidden under the names that he was using, that were coming through for him. And so I think that I want to give different answers for each of them. For Jung, I think, again, it's that kind of blend of what he's been exposed to externally, the material he's taken in, and then how that participates in his visionary experiences. For Tolkien, it seems like those elements really were just coming through. And here I kind of want to look to, this kind of ties back into your question actually around the role of good and evil in both texts, because it's no accident that they're writing, they're having their Red Book periods in conjunction with the First World War, and that Europe is being torn apart by this war, and all clearly evil is present, but who is evil? Can you actually blame the evil on an other? Every person, each side is in some sense both embodying good and evil and right and wrong. And I think this is very much informing these two creation myths that were written either during the war or right in the wake of the war, in some sense to try and make sense of what happened, to make sense both consciously for these individuals, but also to make sense in a larger mythic context of what is the nature of the divine if this level of evil can erupt so unexpectedly as the Great War was. So many people didn't expect it to be like that. And so these Gnostic myths that both men wrote in a certain sense, or that have Gnostic elements, I think are reflective of the tensions and the oppositions of good and evil that were inherent in the world at that particular time, and were really coming to a peak. And then, of course, I think are still relevant as we continue to live in a war-torn world. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do either of you have additional questions you'd like to ask? I'm satisfied for myself at the moment.
I am as well.
I hope to continue talking with you later. We're going to excuse ourselves.
Do we take Craig with us?
Yes, we'll port Craig with us as we leave.
I think he has enough juice.
Are you okay
Taking
fielding
questions?
questions yourself, or do you
I
want me to
am.
bring someone up here to moderate for you?
I'm happy to field the question.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will hand you over to Becca to ask questions, and we will make our departure for the moment. Let's see.
there.
Hi, Craig.
Yes, Max.
I'm assuming you looked at their birth charts, their transits. How many correlations were there?
I knew this question would have come up. I said I knew this question would come up. So astrology is in many ways the hidden methodology behind this, and it is not part of the text at all. And so I did look into this and actually focused on it a number of years ago and was writing about it. I thought I would have a chapter looking at their birth charts, their transits during this period, seeing how they're going through the same transits, or the same transits that are happening collectively are highlighting different parts of their chart, and why that's going to then come through as these different expressions. And then I decided that I needed to not have that be part of this project as much, because it comes back again to, you can see so clearly, for example, the two red books emerged in these years of, during the First World War, and correlate with a Uranus-Neptune opposition. So Uranus, the awakening, inspiration, radical opening up to the Neptunian, of imagination, of fantasy, of the spiritual, the numinous, and so on, fits perfectly. And there's a whole kind of interesting series of correlations as those two planets have come together through the 20th century. The Lord of the Rings was published the next time the two of them came together. And Jung brought out Memories, Dreams, Reflections, or did the interviews for Memories, Dreams, Reflections during that same Uranus-Neptune square. And then the films of The Lord of the Rings were made in the 90s with the Uranus-Neptune conjunction. And the decision to publish Jung's Red Book was made in 2000, right at the end of that alignment. But so that's kind of, it's holding the archetypal background. And then from that place, I wanted to look at the particularities, because the thing that I found so striking between the Red Books wasn't just the archetypal similarity, which was so clearly there, but what are the specifics that they had in common that are reflective of those archetypal qualities, and also reflect a commonality in the manifestation of those archetypes. So that's been my relationship to an astrological perspective on this project. But I do have an article that I'm going to bring out on the subject at some point. Yeah, Sam.
This question in some ways relates to the question that Jake posed, relating to, he said he wanted to go from above and below. And it does incorporate elements of both, but wants to look a little bit more at the nature of the above from your understanding. You brought in early on Jorge's participatory understanding, though as Jorge poses it, as I've understood him, his project was largely looking to deconstruct a perennialist perspective of the transcendent. And yet when we're looking at this project you're doing, these two men who enter an imaginal world, and there's these stark similarities. You had mentioned something that's indeterminate but archetypally patterned. So my question is, for you, does this seem to indicate that the imaginal itself, or the divine itself, does have this deep archetypal patterning? In some ways their experiences and the parallels between them are expressive of that patterning endemic, or is there, Jorge talks about different modes of participatory enactment creating different spiritual realities. It's like an ocean with many shores. Is there maybe a reason in terms of Tolkien and Jung, there may be historical that they're historically contemporaneous and that they're geographically relatively proximal to one another, that led them to kind of happen upon a similar shore.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense.
So I've worked constructively with Jorge's ideas, and in some sense I'm applying parts of them to this and not using all of them, and I've been kind of turning an archetypal lens into to reshape to a certain extent what Jorge is saying. And so he talks about an indeterminate spiritual mystery, and I'm positing a non-determined archetypal divine, and that in some sense posits maybe a little bit more of a there than I think Jorge would be willing to give. But the fact that you can see these kind of large archetypal expressions come through the world's religions, that there is some kind of patterning there, but at a very, very deep level and in a non-determined way, rather than completely indeterminate. And I'm losing the second part of your question. Oh, okay. Great. But yeah, this is something that I think I'm going to be engaging with for a long time. I don't feel like I have answers, or the answers by any means. Laura.
So I'm super interested in going back to ecology and landscape, and I wonder if, like, as you were describing your chapter in response to Craig's question, and you talked about, you know, your memories of spires of fog, I think, or mist in the redwoods, I couldn't help but imagine also just the natural landscape in our world as a bridge, right, into that imaginal world. But then I wonder if there are also specific places, not just landscape broadly, but a tree or a specific redwood and things like that. And I wonder if you could, those are both trees, but I wonder if you could speak to that, either of your own experience or particularly in the book, if it was not just a broad geography, but actual very specific kind of almost like deities that exist in these, you know, in our realm, that maybe it could act as bridges or portals, if you will, into that realm of imagination.
Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of comes to the idea, thinking particularly in terms of this realm, and that maybe something like the collective unconscious of places or morphogenetic fields, that a relationship with a certain redwood or a certain place is over time going to kind of co-create with that place and with the imaginal a sacred location where yeah, you can feel that there is a maybe subtle, maybe not, depending who you are, kind of ontological difference to that place. And that I certainly find there are some parts of the world that it's much easier to engage with active imagination than others. It's a lot harder to do it in the middle of a city, in a room with 90-degree angles, than when you're out in a forest and the world is already breathing that imagination with you. So yeah, I think certain places certainly can be, can facilitate that. And we all have different places. What might be very meaningful to one person or a group of people may not be to others. And of course, recognizing what is to some people and respecting that is a very important element of it. But yeah, absolutely. Mark.
One more on the from below, from above, is that all right?
Of course.
When you located tentatively the presence of misogyny and racism in both men's works in their personal histories and conditioning culturally, and what you might have called later in your presentation consensual reality, what do you think of the possibility that that might, as as truly be infection from a place like Mordor into their world rather than something from the phenomenal world.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to pick that apart and to discriminate it. And as someone who's been focusing on a middle realm, a middle path, a middle earth, I often like to try and answer that it's perhaps both, and that that kind of coming from below, a almost like evil numinosity is part of it, and that there's also individual responsibility and cultural responsibility that has to be taken, because that does get enacted and brought forward into the world, and made real in a different sense. I've ruined all my vocabulary, real and fantasy. So yeah, I would say it's a combination. Yeah.
Becca, I'd like to pick up on the ecology question from the front. From my understanding of Tolkien, there were physical locations that inspired him in that sense that you spoke about, which allowed him, even if it was the memory of those places that allowed him to reach that realm. I don't know if that is the case for Jung as well. I'm not sure if you can just talk to that.
Yeah, I can. For Tolkien, for example, one of these places was the countryside of Serhol, where he spent his early childhood and very much inspired the Shire. And it was the loss of that landscape to industrialization that kind of helped shape so much of what he was expressing in The Lord of the Rings, and the kind of tragedy of destroying the forest, destroying the landscape, of harming the earth past the point of healing. He will talk about. For Jung, I know there were mountaintops that when he would ascend to those mountain peaks, he felt as though he was in God's world. And actually, I didn't speak about this, but the way that Jung talks about God's world actually, I think, correlates more with this idea of fairy, or the mundus imaginalis, than the collective unconscious. These early experiences that he had, and they were very much connected to the mountaintops, to forests. He felt that trees embodied the sacred meaning of life. So both of them did carry that in, and had particular relationships to particular places.
Can I interrupt?
Yes.
So we've deliberated, and we basically have four options. We can not pass the dissertation. We can pass it outright. We can pass it with minor revisions, which would mean Beck would have to do a little bit of work on it and then give it back just to me to approve. Or we can pass it with major revisions, which means we're going to ask her to do a little bit more, and it would have to go back to the three members of the committee. But after we deliberated for a short period of time, we are very happy to pass you outright and to say congratulations on an extraordinary So I'm going to take just a quick moment to allow each of us on the committee to say a couple of short words, and then we'll let Becca say whatever she would like to. I just want to say it's a real privilege and an honor to have worked on this with you. No one in this room, but there have been times when I worked on dissertations at other institutions when I don't look forward to reading them. Whereas every installment of this I looked forward to, like waiting for a magazine as they used to come in the mail, when it would come with something you'd want to read. It was just a real delight. And it's so beautifully written, and just a real treat and an honor for me to be a part of.
I'd like to second that and say how much of an honor and privilege it was to be brought on. And I was especially impressed by the fact that Becca really did some very significant revision on relatively short notice and was really very responsive to comments and incorporated, you know, feedback in a very substantive way. And as a committee member, of course, that made me feel very good. And you know, the work is magnificent, and just like to say it was an experience where I found someone who was passionate about the imagination as I was, and had, you know, the intelligence to match that passion, which is rare. And it was an experience where I was doing a little bit of teaching, but I was doing just as much learning in the process. So, congratulations.
So congratulations, Doctor. And look forward to the book, then the documentary, then the lecture series, then the collected works. But before you get started on any of that, I'm technically not allowed to give you any more assignments, but I want to give you one anyway, and that is that now you have to put up a sign that says no admittance except on party business.
I already have one.
Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Wow. First of all, thanks to each of you for being here, and all of you on Zoom as well. I feel so supported. It's just an extraordinary feeling. And yeah, to each one of my committee members, you have been such wonderful guides, and both supportive and encouraging, and also discerning and pushing me. And I have felt myself evolve in this process, and I'm so grateful for that, because why else do we do it? And to Daniel, when you came on, I just knew you were the right person for this project, and to go into that imaginal world. I've been so inspired by your work, so thank you for that. And Craig, thank you for continuing to stick with me, even as you've gone to Pacifica, and the tremendous encouragement in terms of this particular topic and just in general. And Jake sticking with me even when you went to England for 3 years. I feel like people join my committee and leave. And yet they stay with me. And I wouldn't have known that I could write about Tolkien in a graduate school context if it hadn't been for you. And having Tolkien's essay on fairy stories in your creative imagination class in 2012. So thank you for realizing that my deep amateur passion could become this. I just want to say a couple other thank yous, because both my parents are here, and I feel so blessed to have parents who not only support what I'm doing, but get it, that they understand what I'm doing and why. I realize what a tremendous privilege that is, so thank you both. I've had innumerable friends supporting me through this process, and I can't name all of you, but there are 4 that I really do feel I have to name, because you have been the midwives for me in going through what really has felt like a birth process. And Laura Machete and Lily Falconer and Olga Sommer and Sam Sommer, you've been there every single day for me, and I am so grateful. And finally, my husband, Matt Siegel. The 10,000 conversations, every emotion expressed, all the meals cooked, and my time and space protected, and eternal encouragement. And for doing it before me too, for going through this process and showing that it can be done. So, thank you.
Congratulations. Dr. Thomas.
Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I'm sure you all have lots more questions for Becca. She might be willing to talk about some of them now or more likely in the future after she's had some respite. But also thanks for being here for the first Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion dissertation defense. This was one for the books.
Thank you.
I'm so proud of you. Very good.